Question 16 says, what is least likely to cause a simultaneous increase in demand pool and cost push inflation? Like I was saying earlier, inflation is the gradual increase in the general price level over a certain period of time, which basically means that prices are going to rise. Now, demand pool and cost push are the two types of inflations, and they should be pretty explanatory because demand pool inflation is caused due to excess aggregate demand, and cost push inflation is caused by high cost of production, which will shift the supply curve to the right, causing an increase in causing higher prices. So that would be higher cost of production. Right, so let's check our options. Yeah, I'm so sorry about that. But still, the first one says depreciation of currency. So depreciation of currency basically means that the value of your currency has decreased. Now, as an example, let's take, let's say China. Actually, this is a very fitting example. So China uses yuan, right? So this is its currency. So if the value of its currency has depreciated, it essentially means that, well, its exports will become cheaper, while its imports will become more expensive. Okay, so does this cause demand pull inflation and cost push inflation? Well, if exports are cheaper, exports are what you sell outside to other countries because right? Outside exports. So if your exports are cheaper, they would be more internationally competitive, which means that more countries will demand your good because it's cheap. Who doesn't like cheap things? So you are more likely to sell more exports because they are more internationally competitive. And in AD, or aggregate demand, the components of aggregate demand includes consumption, investment, government spending, and of course, net exports, which can be found by exports minus imports. So if the value of exports increases, that means that the value of aggregate demand will increase. So that can cause excess aggregate demand. So yes, that can cause demand pool inflation. And so imports, if imports are more expensive, well, for example, let's say you import capital, machinery to make your goods, right? So if imports are more expensive and if you import your capital, then your cost of production will increase because they're more expensive because of your depreciated currency. So will that cause cost push inflation? Well, possibly yes, because you will have a higher cost of production. So, but the question asks us, what is least likely to cause both of these? And now, right off the bat, the first option obviously causes both types of inflations. So we can immediately cross that out because that cannot be it. Oh God, it was getting messy. I'm sorry. I'm just gonna keep it like this. Right. So let's look at the second option. The second option says increased import tariffs. Now, import tariffs are a type of protectionism method, which are methods used to protect domestic firms from foreign competition. Now, import tariffs are basically a tax on imports. So if we have a tax on imports, imports will basically just get more expensive because higher taxes always makes things more expensive because like you kind of layer it on the price. So more expensive imports, again, if you import maybe capital or machinery, that will increase your cost of production. So does it cause cost push inflation? Possibly yes. But does it cause demand pool inflation? Well, if imports are more expensive, then consumers are less likely to buy more imports. So in AD, like I said, the components are consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports. If imports decreases, then net exports might increase, but that's like probably by a small fraction, probably not by a lot, but that's still possible. So again, we can cross it out because that's, well, one of it's occurring. And this one's possible too, so we'll just cross that out. That can't be it either. It's like for a more certain option. Now the next option says decreased spending on infrastructure. So infrastructure can be like roads or buildings for better working conditions. So, but it says decreased spending. Now we don't know if it's the firms who are spending that, spending it on infrastructure, or if it's governments. But AD again, the components are consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports. So it could either stimulate investment or government spending because spending on infrastructure, right? Either one of them could have done it. But it says decreased spending. That means AD will fall. So demand pull inflation, not possible, probably not. Cost push inflation will decrease spending on infrastructure. I'm not exactly sure how that relates to cost of production. I don't think it exactly does, so that's kind of irrelevant. So you know what, this is a possible answer because it doesn't cause demand pull inflation and it doesn't really relate to cost push inflation. So you know what, possibly, let's keep that in mind. The last one says increased wages. Now, if wages increase, right, then labor would have higher incomes. If labor has higher incomes, they're more likely to have higher disposable incomes. If they have higher disposable incomes, they are likely to have higher purchasing power. So if they have higher purchasing power, they are more likely to consume more and spend more. So consumption might be stimulated, AD might increase. So demand pull inflation, possible. And cost push inflation, well, wages are paid to labor, and labor, well, is kind of a resource to production. And if the wages increase, that means the cost of hiring labor increases, which is basically a higher cost of production. So cost push inflation, also possible. So you know what, this actually this can cause both of these, and that's not what we're looking for, so cross that off. And C seems like the best choice, and C is definitely the correct answer. Now, number 17. According to the circular flow of income, what would be the immediate result of an increase in the value of a country's exports? First of all, what is a circular flow of income? It is basically an economic model that shows how money moves from producers to consumers. So you know what, let's just draw a rough sketch of that. So we will have consumers, are also known as households, and firms. Right. So households own your typical factors of production, your land, labor, capital, right? And firms want to use them to produce these goods and services. So how it works is that households produce your factors of production, or FOP, produces them, right? Provides them. Oh, sorry, that's the other way around. No, sorry, the firms will give them the factors of payment rewards, factor payments, so that they will produce goods and services. Let's just say G and S. And so this is the movement of money. So households would pay firms to buy these goods and services. So that's like them spending it, right? And then the money just moves like that, on and on. Firms pay households, households produce the goods and services, and the households buy it from the firms again. So the money moves from households to firms, firms to households, again and again in a circular, non-stop motion. That's why it's circular flow of income. So, but what other factors really affect this circular flow of income? So this is circular flow of income, right? So how can we increase the circle or decrease the circle? Because there must be a way for money to leak or be injected in, right? So actually, yes, we do have injections or leakages that show ways of how money can go into the circular flow or out of it. So the injections include government spending. Oh, I'm so sorry. Government spending and investment. And your leakages include savings and taxation. But depending on whether this is an open or closed economy, open meaning it does foreign free trade with other countries, and closed meaning that it doesn't. If it is open, then it also includes exports because that's what comes in from other countries. Sorry, that is the payment you get by selling stuff, your exports to other countries. And leakages will also include imports because you buy stuff from other countries, so your money goes out of your country, so out of your circular flow of income. Well, this hasn't really exactly mentioned whether it's open or closed, but just to let you know that free trade includes exports and imports, whereas an open circular flow of income includes these two other factors, but closed ones do not include these, okay? So let's look at the options first. Imports would increase, right? So it says that in this circular flow of income, what would be the immediate results of an increase in the value of exports? So increase in injections, right? So okay, imports would increase. No. Why would imports increase? Well, I know you might be thinking that, well, imports might increase to match the increase in exports so that this whole thing will be in equilibrium. But the circular flow of income is never exactly in equilibrium. Never, the leakages and injections are never always equal. And nothing can exactly always be equal in the real world either. So just because injections or exports increases, it does not necessarily mean that we will try to keep the balance of the world and that imports will increase to no, that's not it, cross it off. So the second one says that national income would increase. Now what is national income? It typically means like the sum of the total incomes in the country or in the economy. And you know what? That makes sense because if you increase your exports, it would increase your injections. So it will increase the money flowing in the circulation, and so it would increase the factor payments given to households by firms because, well, the circular flow of money, the money flowing in this cycle has increased. So yes, the incomes of households will increase, or the national income will increase in this economy. So yes, that's possible. So let's just consider that option. Now the next one says that savings would increase. Savings are leakages, and like I said, nothing is always in equilibrium. Just because your injections increase doesn't mean that something from your leakages will increase. So that's kind of like the same logic with the first option with A, so now cross that off. That doesn't make sense. Taxes would increase. That's the same thing. This is a leakage. No, it doesn't make sense. No. So it leaves you with only B, and yes, B is actually the correct option, so that's what we'll be choosing. Right. Oh God, I'm so sorry for this mess. But anyway, number 18. Right, number 18. To calculate the unemployment rate, the number unemployed is related to, so we are going to calculate the unemployment rate. To do that, it will be unemployment, the number of people who are unemployed divided by the labor force, which is the total number of people who are a part of the labor force. Basically meaning unemployed, number of unemployed people plus those who are employed. That is the labor force. That's how you calculate the rate. So now it says the number unemployed is related to meaning divided by. Well, it's divided by the labor force. So we're going to look for an answer that matches up with this. So looking at the first option, the total adult population aged 18 is 65. Well, although yes, this is like the typical working age, it does not exactly specify whether this population is employed or unemployed, because there may be certain people who are unable to work or are not actively seeking work. So they would not exactly classify as either unemployed or employed. So this doesn't specifically specify the labor force, so no, I'm going to cross that out. Now it says the number of unemployed who are seeking work. Well, if you are considered an unemployed person, you will be seeking work. That is that's kind of the characteristic of definition of that. But no, that's not what we're dividing it by. We're dividing it by the labor force, which includes both unemployed people and employed people. So no, we cross that off. Now the third one says the total number in full-time employment. Well, yes, this does specify those who are employed, but no, it says full-time. So there might be some part-time employed people, who knows, but it's not specifically specifying the entirety of the labor force, so that can't be it. Now it's probably the last one. The total population of the labor force. Yes, this directly refers to the labor force. So yes, D is the answer, and that is correct. Now the next question says, aggregate demand in an economy may decrease as a result of an increase in what? So okay, actually, let's write aggregate demand is the total demand in the country. It is identified by its components of consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports, which is basically exports minus imports. All right, so aggregate demand in an economy may decrease as a result of an increase in what? All right, let's look at the options. So consumption expenditure, this refers to C, consumption. If this increases, will it decrease aggregate demand? No, it would stimulate it. It would increase it. So that can't be it. Cross that off. Government expenditure, well, that's also a component. Same case. If this increases, 80 will increase. Does not lead to a decrease. So no, cross that off. The next one, import expenditure. Now net exports is exports minus imports, right? So if imports increases, the value of net exports will decrease, which will decrease the 80 value. You know what? So that seems correct. So we'll keep that in mind. The next one is investment expenditure. Well, you know what? Same case. If this increases, this will increase. Does not lead to decrease. So 19C is the answer, and that is correct. Now the next one. Number 20, a government has a balanced budget. It decides to increase its spending by 10%, which increase in government revenue would produce a budget surplus. Okay, so when we talk about government budgets, the government having a balanced budget or a surplus or budget surplus or a budget deficit, what it's referring to is it refers to the government's tax revenue. Oh, sorry, no, actually, let's just write T, tax revenue, because that's how it earns money, right? So tax revenue minus its government spending. So if these two values are equal, then it will equal to 0, and that will make a balanced budget. However, if this is greater, if tax revenue is greater than government spending, it will lead to surplus because the value will be greater than 0. But if government spending were greater than tax revenue, then it would be a minus value, which would indicate a deficit, right? So now that we got that, tax revenue minus government spending, it was in a balanced budget, but now it decides to increase its spending by 10%. So we don't know what tax revenue should be, so it has increased its spending by 10%, right? Now, which increase in government revenue, referring to taxation, it's tax revenue, that's basically the same thing, would produce a budget surplus. Now we want a value greater than 0 here, right? So we can just plug in each of the percentages and see what could be it. If we put in minus 10, it would be minus 10% minus 10%, it would be minus 20%. That would be a deficit, so no. If you do 0, it would be 0% minus 10%, which would finally give us minus 10%, so nope. Plus 10% minus 10%, that would give us 0, which is a balanced budget. That's not what we want. We want a surplus, so nope. 20 minus 10%, 20% minus 10% will give us 10% plus 10%, positive 10%, which is greater than 0. And that does give us a budget surplus. So D would be our answer. And yes, D is the correct answer. Question number 21. An economy has an unemployment rate of 8%, an increase of 2% from the previous year. At the same time, the current account deficit rose from 3% of GDP to 4% of GDP. What would be most likely to reduce both unemployment and the current account deficit? Okay, so let's break it down again. So this time we've been given two pieces of information. It says that an economy has an unemployment rate of 8%. Which is an increase of 2% from the previous year, meaning that the unemployment rate has increased, right? And this basically means that the number of people unemployed has increased. So, and then also at the same time, the current account deficit has risen from 3% of GDP to 4% of GDP, which basically means that current account deficit has increased. The deficit has increased. But okay, what is the current account, right? First of all, the current account essentially is the record of a nation's transactions with the rest of the world over a defined period. So the components of the current account includes trade in goods, trade in services, and also the primary income and the secondary income. So goods and services are pretty simple. You have exports and imports. Exports being what the goods and services that go out of the country, and imports being the goods and services that come into the country bought by local people. As for the primary income, it is income received from labor or capital from abroad. So for example, it would be like wages from people living abroad, or dividends or foreign investment profits, such and such. And as the secondary income, it is a transfer payment. And what transfer payments basically mean is that you get money for free. You don't need to return anything to the person who gave you that money. So for example, foreign aid. So a current account deficit means that if you add up everything in all the components in the current account, so the money that comes into the country would be plus, and the money that goes out would be subtracted or minused. So the deficit means that the overall value of this is less than zero, right? But if it's a surplus, it would be greater than zero. Now it says, what would be most likely to reduce both unemployment and the current account deficit? Okay, so now let's just look at the options first. So the first one says decrease government spending. Okay, so how does this tie to any of this? Well, if you decrease government spending is a component of aggregate demand, which includes consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports, right? So if you decrease government spending, then this would decrease, then AD as a whole will decrease. And as labor is derived demand, meaning that the demand for this doesn't increase unless the demand for the good or AD increases, the demand for this will not increase. So if AD decreases, the demand for labor will also decrease. So if you decrease government spending, demand for labor decreases, and so unemployment will increase. Because that means that less people are being employed, because they're being demanded less. So does that reduce unemployment? No, it increases unemployment. And how about the current account deficit? Well, if AD decreases, then the demand for labor will decrease. That means that there will be less output. If there is less output, then there is most likely less goods being exported, so less exports, right? So if there are less exports, then the value of goods and services, like the net exports of goods and services, will decrease. So that might decrease the current account, the whole value of this, right? That might fall. So does that decrease the deficit? No, it's increasing the deficit. So that can't be it either. That can't be it. So we're gonna, oh my goodness. Wait, actually no, like this. Oh my God. So we're gonna cross that off. That cannot be our option. The second one says depreciation of the currency. Now, what does depreciation of the currency means? It means that the value of the currency has fallen. So if the value of your currency falls, the main thing you need to keep in mind is that your exports will be cheaper and your imports will be more expensive. So with this in mind, if the value of your currency depreciates, what happens? Well, since your exports are more cheaper, it will become more internationally competitive. If it is more internationally competitive, it basically means that people will buy or demand more of your exports because they're cheap. And people like cheap things, right? So that means that the value of your, so it's not like this anymore, the value of your exports is likely to increase. So the whole value of the current account itself is likely to increase. So that might lead to a balanced budget from, okay, if you're moving from a deficit, right, that might go to a balanced budget or a surplus. So does that reduce the current account deficit? Yes, because it's going to, well, increase up to a surplus possibly because the value of the current account as a whole is increasing, right? So if your exports also become cheaper since they'll be demanded more, the value of the net exports in aggregate demand is likely to increase as well. If net exports increases, AD will increase. If AD increases, since labor is derived demand, right? The demand for labor is likely to increase. If the demand for labor increases, then more people are likely to be employed because employers would want to employ more workers to produce more goods. So employment is likely to increase. So does that reduce unemployment? Well, reducing unemployment basically means increasing employment. And yes, that's true. So that ticks off both boxes. So we'll keep that in mind. That's a possible answer. So now the next one says increase indirect taxation. What is indirect taxation? Indirect taxation refers to taxes on goods and services. So that would basically make your goods and services more expensive. If that happens, I should have kept the aggregate demand, but the components of aggregate demand is consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports, right? So if indirect taxation increases, the prices of goods and services increases, so that would reduce the purchasing power or like make people less attracted to buying it more. So consumption is likely to decrease, right? Then that means aggregate demand is likely to decrease as well. So if aggregate demand decreases, again, because labor has derived demand, the demand for labor decreases, that means employment will decrease, right? So if employment decreases, that just basically means that unemployment increases. So does that reduce unemployment? Nope, it does not reduce that. As for current account deficit, well, if the indirect taxation increases, that would increase the prices of your goods and services. So your exports may become more expensive. So that means that the prices, if the prices increase, they become less cheap, they become more expensive, right? So they become less internationally competitive, so that would decrease the demand for it, right? So as a whole, the value of the current account may decrease, leading to a greater deficit. So does that reduce the deficit? Oh man, oh goodness. But does that reduce the deficit? No, it doesn't. So that can't be it. Cross that off. The last one says an increase in interest rates. What are interest rates? Interest rates are the cost of borrowing and the reward for saving. So if interest rates increase, the cost of borrowing will increase and the reward for saving increases. So it is more attractive to save rather than borrow. So consumption is also likely to decrease because less people will borrow and spend. They are more likely to save and keep their money and not use it, right? So consumption decreases, AD decreases, again, labor decreases, employment decreases, does not reduce unemployment. But if interest rates increase because the reward for saving increases, then hot money inflow may increase. So the primary income might increase because more people are attracted to like investing in the country. So that might lead to an increase in the current account deficit, but it only checks out one feature here, so this one can't be it too. So our final verdict would be B, and that is the correct answer. Oh goodness, okay. Number 22, the diagram shows an aggregate demand curves for an economy. Which combination is most likely to have caused the shift from AD1 to AD1 to AD2? It's saying that the curve of AD1 has moved to AD2. So which combination is most likely to have caused that? So if a curve shifts to the left, that means that it has decreased. So AD has decreased. And what are the components of AD? Let's just write that down again. It's consumption plus investment plus government spending and net exports. Okay, so which combinations is most likely to have caused a decrease in AD? So we are given income tax and sales tax. If we increase income tax, then that means that consumers will have less income, right? Less disposable income, right? Because proportion of income taken as tax increases. Let's say if income tax increases, higher proportion of income being taken as tax, so disposable income decreases. So that is most likely to, if you have less income to spend, then you are likely to buy less because you can't buy more because you have a limited amount of income. So consumption is likely to decrease, so that will lead to a fall of AD. So yeah, that's true. But if income tax decreases, that'll be the opposite, right? So because less proportion of income taken as tax, so more disposable income, so consumption will increase. But in this case, we're going to look in the perspective of income tax increasing because that does lead to a decrease in AD. Now sales tax, right? So sales tax is a tax on goods and services. If the sales tax increases, right, the goods and services, the price of goods and services will increase. So the price of goods and services will increase. So meaning it will be more expensive to buy these goods and services. So if it's more expensive, then you will be able to buy less because you have less purchasing power. So if the sales tax increases, then you are less likely to consume more. So you will consume less. So consumption also decreases due to an increase in sales tax. So AD will also decrease, right? So both increase in income tax and sales tax will lead to a decrease in consumption, leading to a decrease of AD as a whole. So the combination we're looking for is an increase in income tax and an increase in sales tax. All right, let's look at income tax first. So it can't be decreased, not decreased. It has to increase. And now for sales tax, it has to increase. And increase is correct, but cannot decrease. It has to increase. So these two, option D fits both of the requirements, and that is the correct answer. Number 23, what can be considered an expansionary supply-side policy? So, all right, what is a supply-side policy? Supply-side policies are designed to increase the quantity or quality of aggregate supply. So if it's expansionary, it especially means increases. But if it's contractionary, it's meaning to decrease it, okay? So the first option says an increase in government expenditure on training. In a policy, if it involves the government, if it directly involves the government, then the policy is likely to be fiscal. But if it directly involves the central bank, then it's most likely to be monetary. So in this case, an increase in government's expenditure on training can be a fiscal policy, but it is spending on training. So if you increase training, then of course training will increase. But this training is obviously placed on your labor or your workers. So the quality of labor is most likely to increase because you become more productive, you become more knowledgeable, so you might be able to increase your output. So the quality of labor or productivity of labor increases. So as the quality of labor increases, labor is considered a resource to production, right? So it's considered an aggregate supply, part of it at least. So if the quality of labor increases, quality of aggregate demand increases. So is it an expansionary supply side policy? It is possible, right? So we'll keep that in mind. The second one says an increase in sales tax. Now, when it comes to taxation, that's of course implemented by the government. So therefore, it is likely a fiscal policy. And if you increase a sales tax, then sales tax are placed on goods and services. So that means that the price of goods and services, the price of it will increase. So that means that if the price increases, then it becomes more expensive. So consumers are less likely to consume them. So part of the aggregate demand thing, right? Consumption plus investment plus government spending plus net exports. consumption is likely to decrease, so aggregate demand is likely to decrease. So that is a contractionary fiscal policy. And does that really relate to aggregate supply at all? Nope, so that can't be it. Third one says an increase in the rate of interest. What is the rate of interest again? The rate of interest is the cost of borrowing and the reward for saving. So, if the rate of interest increases, the cost of borrowing increases, the reward for saving increases, so it's more attractive to save, right? So if you save more, you spend less. Same case, AD decreases, contractionary monetary policy, because interest rates are controlled by central banks. So contractionary monetary policy, does that relate to AS at all? Sorry, aggregate supply at all? Nope, so cross that off. Last option says an increase of the exchange rate. So if there is an increase in the exchange rate, that means that your exchange rate has appreciated. That means the value of your exchange rate has increased. So if the value of your exchange rate increases, that basically means that the price of your exports become more expensive and the price of your imports become more cheaper. So the exchange rate, if it's a fixed exchange rate, is controlled by the central bank. Therefore, this is a monetary policy. And if imports are cheaper, then your economy is more likely to purchase more imports because it's cheap and people like cheap things. And as your exports are more expensive, they are less internationally competitive, so the demand for exports decreases. So, aggregate demand, consumption plus investment plus government spending plus net exports. So as imports increases, right, since net exports is exports minus imports, if imports increases, then net exports decreases, so AD decreases. So that's a contractionary monetary policy, but does that relate to AS? Nope. So our only option is A, and that is correct. Number 24. The table indicates the factor imports required to produce wheat and cars in countries X and Y. What makes it possible for both countries to benefit from trade? Okay, so looking at this table first, let's see what information it gives us. So it says that the table indicates factor imports required to produce wheat and cars in country X and Y. And so what we would usually do immediately after seeing two countries and two goods that they can produce is to find the opportunity cost ratios of both. So immediately, we'll just do country X, country Y, and then opportunity costs for wheat and a car. And what you'll mainly do is take the maximum units of wheat and car, like that, and then break them down and then get the ratios. But no, actually, you can only do that immediately if they've given you the outputs directly. But in this case, this is importantly factor imports, units of factors inputted to produce the wheat and cars. So to find the opportunity cost ratios, you have to find the units that can be produced, the output for each country. So to do that, since the values given are the number of factor imports to produce 1 ton of wheat or 1 car, what this means is that for country X, right? What this means is that 4 units of resources or factor imports can produce 1 ton of wheat or let's just say 1 wheat, all right? 1 unit of wheat. And 2 units produces 1 car. So for country X, what is the opportunity cost ratio from wheat to car? So, 4 units is greater than 2. So let's assume that we are going to use 4 input units, all right? So we are using 4 input units. If we use 4 input units, we can produce 1 car. Okay, so we have 1 car produced. If we use 4 input units, how many cars can we produce? Well, if we divide 4 by, since the 4 is is the amount of inputs we're putting in, and 2 is the amount of units needed to produce one car. If we divide 4 by 2, we get 2, meaning for 4 units, 2 cars can be produced. So that's the opportunity cost ratio. All right, do the same thing for country Y. So country Y2, you need 8 factor input units to produce 1 wheat and 6 factor input units to produce 6 cars. 6 cars, right? So since 8 units is larger, we're going to input 8 units. Assume that we input 8 units. So country Y, we are using 8 units. We are inputting 8 units. So if we input 8 units, we can get 1 unit of wheat. If we input 8 units, it takes up 6 units to, 1 car, my bad. But it takes 6 units to produce 1 car, therefore 8 divided by 6. You get 4/3, but if you break that down into decimals, that's 1.33 something, but we'll just go with 1.3. So you can produce 1.3 cars with 8 units. Write that down. So what does this tell us? It tells us that country Y has a lower opportunity cost in producing wheat than country X, because to produce 1 unit of wheat, it only gives up 1.3 units of cars, whereas to produce 1 unit of wheat in country X, it gives up 2 units of cars. So that's more than 1.3. So Y has a comparative advantage in producing wheat because it's lower. However, on the flip side, X has a comparative advantage in producing cars, because if you want to find out the opportunity cost of cars, just bring this value and divide it to the other side. So that would mean that to produce 1 car, you would have to give up 0.5 units of wheat. To produce 1 car, you would have to give up 1 divided by 1.33. You would give up 0.75 something something something, which is greater than 0.5. So country X has a lower opportunity cost in producing cars than country Y. Therefore, country X has a comparative advantage in producing cars. Now that we have these 2 pieces of information, let's look at the options. Now the first one says country X has an absolute advantage in wheat and car production. Well, no, because absolute advantage means that for a given number of resources, you can produce more of a good than another country. So in that case, if country X did have a absolute advantage, right, then these 2 values should be greater than these 2 values, because they would have to be able to produce more. But that is not the case. And so, right, I forgot to mention, comparative advantage is where a country can produce, right, I forgot to mention that comparative advantage is where for a given set of resources, a country can produce a good with a lower opportunity cost than another country. So anyway, country X does not have an absolute advantage, although it may have an absolute advantage in cars because 2 is greater than 1.3. It does not have an absolute advantage in wheat, so that is not correct, so we'll cross that off. Now country Y has an absolute advantage in wheat and car production. Now that is also not true. That's just not really the opposite, but Y does not have an absolute advantage in either, because neither of these values are greater than either of these values. So no, that's wrong as well. Just cross that off. Third one says country Y has a comparative advantage in wheat production. You know what? That's true. We've already proven it. It does have a comparative advantage in wheat. So that we'll keep that answer in mind. Last one says the opportunity cost of wheat and car production is the same between countries. Well, that's clearly not true. Look at this. The opportunity cost is definitely not the same, so it cannot be D as well. So C seems like the most likely answer, and that is the correct answer. 25. A government decides to allow the country's currency to depreciate to remove the deficit on its current account of the balance of payments. What is the most likely reason why this would not work? So again, the current account is the record of a nation's transactions with the rest of the world over a defined period, and its components include goods, services, trade in goods and services, and primary income and secondary income. Again, goods and services include exports and imports of goods and of these goods and services. Exports being the goods and services going out of the country or out of the economy, and imports being goods and services that come into the economy. Primary income being the earnings and payments related to the factors of production, for example, wages from abroad, dividends, foreign interests, or profits. And secondary income being transfer payments, meaning that this money is technically free. You just don't need to give anything back. So for example, foreign aid. Now, if a country's currency depreciates, then that means that the value of the currency falls. So if the value of the currency falls, what you need to know is that the price of exports become cheaper and the price of imports become more expensive. Now let's look at the options. All right, the first one says the country gains a competitive advantage from the depreciation. Now, yes, it might become more internationally competitive because exports are cheaper, but it says competitive advantage. I don't think there isn't a competitive advantage. There is only absolute advantage and comparative advantage in free trade. So competitive advantage does not exist and does not make sense, so we're going to cross that off. Second one says the country has a surplus on its capital and financial accounts. Now, as of AES level, we are not taught capital and financial accounts, only the current account, so this is not related, so cross that off. Third one says the price elasticities of demand for the country's exports and imports are greater than 1. That must be referring to the Marshall-Lerner's condition, which states Lerner's condition, right? Which states that if the country's exports and imports, the PED of them are greater than 1, that means that the country will benefit, the country's trade balance will benefit from a depreciation of currency. Okay, so if they benefit from if the country's trade balance benefits, that means that the balance of goods and services, that is exports minus imports, they would benefit, meaning the net exports will be, the net exports is likely to be positive. So that is likely to shift the current account balance from a deficit to a surplus or even balance. But basically means that the value of the current account will increase, so the deficit will decrease. But now the question says, what is the most likely reason why this would not work? Why the deficit will not be removed? So this one is saying that the deficit will be removed and increase their surplus, but that is not what we want. That's not the option we're looking for, so we're crossing that off. Now it's most likely the last one, but anyway, let's read it. There are high trade barriers with the country's main trading partners. Now, what does high trade barriers mean? So high trade barriers are most likely protectionism methods, which are methods used to protect domestic firms from foreign competition. So this includes embargoes, which is a complete ban on imports, and tariffs, which increases price of imports because it is a tax on imports. Now, if the high trade barriers increases, that means that, all right, if I am country X and my trading partner is called country Y, and I import from this country, right? If I import good A, to me, good A is an import. To country Y, good A is an export, right? So if I export good B, to me, good B is an export. And to country Y, good B is an import. So that basically means that there are high trade barriers, protectionism methods could mean tariffs, embargoes, quotas, which will affect the imports. So if, for example, a tariff is placed on country Y's imports, right? Because there are higher trade barriers in my trading partner, which is country Y. That means that the price of imports will increase. the price of imports will increase, which makes it, well, it makes it more expensive. And if it's not cheap, then consumers are not attracted to purchasing imports, meaning the demand for imports will fall. Also, other protectionism methods or high trading barriers could also mean embargoes, which is a complete ban on my imports, or quotas, which is a limit, which is where you limit the number of imports that can enter the country. So essentially, high trading barriers will decrease the demand for imports, for the import of good B. But I am exporting good B. So if the demand for their imports fall, that basically means that the demand for my exports will fall. So if the demand for my exports fall, then my exports will decrease. If my exports decrease, my net exports is likely to decrease. So that's most likely going to turn into a minus. So as a whole of the current account, the value of it is likely to decrease. So the deficit is likely to increase because, well, deficit is minus and it's just going to keep going down. So the question states, why will the deficit not be removed despite the currency being depreciated? Well, this one, despite the currency being depreciated, the deficit is still falling because of these high trading barriers. So you know what, that actually checks out. So that is most likely our answer, and D is correct, yes. Right. 26. When must the terms of trade of a country change? Now, what is the terms of trade? The terms of trade, also known as TOT for short, the index of, oh goodness, the index of export prices over the index of import prices multiplied by 100. Okay, so if the value, right, the value of the TOT increases, like this value increases, then that is favorable. And if that decreases, that is unfavorable. Now, when must the terms of trade of a country change? Let's look at the options. First one says when the volume of exports fall and the volume of imports rise. Well, the formula is referring to the index of prices of exports and imports. So the volume doesn't really matter. So we're going to cross that off. It's not the volume. It's talking about prices. Second one says when the total value of exports fall and the total value of imports rises. Now again, we're not talking about values. We're talking about prices. Price, index of import and export prices. So no, cross that off. Third one says when the balance of trade in goods move from deficit to surplus. So the balance of trade in goods is referring to the exports of goods minus imports of goods. So it says that it moves from a deficit to a surplus, meaning it's moving from probably a minus value to a plus value. But does that correlate to terms of trade at all? Does it talk about index of export prices or index of import prices? Neither of them. So that is not the right answer. We're crossing that off. Last one says when the average price of export rises and the average price of imports fall. Average price. So yes, that is correct. So when the average price of exports rises and the average price of import falls, then the TOT is likely to increase. And so yes, that does cause a change in the terms of trade. So D is our correct answer, and it is correct. Number 27. The table shows an extract from a country's balance of payments. All of this stuff. What is the current account balance? All right, the current account balance includes, the components are the trade in goods, trade in services, primary income, secondary income. Yep, that's all included in the current account balance. Now, exports are what come into the country and imports are what go out of the country. So if it's inside, it's plus. If it's outside, it's minus. So what you basically do is add all of this up minus with all of this. So just put that in the calculator. So the total value of exports is $355 billion. And the total value of imports is $370. So to find the current account balance, it's exports minus imports. Therefore, 355 minus 370, which is minus 15. Right? So we find an answer that matches with this. Minus 10? Nope. Minus 15? Oh yes, actually that one's it. Minus 30? Nope. Minus 50? Nope. So the answer is B, and that is correct. The table shows the goods balance and the services balance for a country in selected years. Between which years did the overall goods and services balance change the most? So first of all, let's just look for the balance of each year, right? So to find that, you just add the two balances together. So for 2015, 120 minus 30, it is plus 90. For 2016, plus 110 minus 30, it is plus 80. And 2017, plus 50 minus 10, plus 40. 2018, 130 minus 60, plus 70. 2019, 140 minus 50, that's plus 90. Okay, so it says between which years did the overall goods and services balance, overall balance basically, change the most? So let's just look at the options first. Now A says between 2015 and 16, so between these two. Find the difference between that, and that would be it decreased by 10. And for 2016, 2017, it decreased by 40. And for 2017, 2018, it increased by 30. For 2018 and 2019, it increased by 20. So which option changed the most, right? Now, as you look at that, minus 40 is the greatest value, so this must be the greatest change. And that is between 2016 2017, which is this one. So the answer is B, and that is correct. Now, 29. The diagram shows the market for both domestic and imported computers for an economy. The world price is P1. Which government policy would lead to a price of P2? So the question says that the world price is originally P1, right? So it's P1, so the original equilibrium is here. Now the price has increased up to P2, right? So the new equilibrium is right here for P2. So now basically for the price of P1 to increase to P2, the supply curve has shifted to the left to S2. So basically it's asking which policy could have shifted the supply curve to the left, right? So let's look at the options. First one says an embargo on imports. What is an embargo on imports? That is a complete ban on imports, meaning no imports will be going into the country. So will that decrease the supply and shift it to the left? Yes, but the question says that this diagram shows the market for both domestic and imported computers. Like here, domestic and imported computers. And this supply curve right here seems to only represent the domestic supply, right? So no imports are included. So if there were an embargo on imports, no more imports. So the supply curve would be here. However, the supply curve shift that we're looking for is the one of S2. So this one still contains both domestic and imported goods, not a complete ban on imports because there are still imports present in this supply curve of S2. If it were embargoes, there was an embargo, then the supply curve would shift to this one where there's only domestic supply left. So that cannot be it. Let's cross that off. The second one says an exchange rate appreciation. Right, so if an exchange rate appreciates, that means that the value of the exchange rate increases. So if the value increases, then exports will become more expensive and imports will become cheaper, right? So consumers are attracted to cheap things. So because imports have become cheaper, then the demand for imports will rise. If the demand for imports rise, then that means, the demand for imports increases. So that will affect the demand curve, not the supply curve. It doesn't really imply an increase in the supply of imports because it only affects demand. Nothing here really talks about the supply of imports increasing, so it cannot be that because it affects demand, not supply. Now C says a subsidy to domestic producers. Now, if domestic producers are subsidized, well, since subsidies are kind of like a grant given by the government to firms to increase their supply, because subsidies would reduce the cost of production, the supply curve will shift to the right because the domestic supply will increase. Domestic supply increases and imports are also present. So, but that's not what we're looking for. We're looking for a shift to the left, so that can be it. Cross that off. Now the last one says a tariff on imports. So what are tariffs on imports? Tariffs are a tax on imports. So if there is a tax on imports, imports will become more expensive. So if they become more expensive, since they are less cheaper, consumers are less attracted to buying imports, so the demand for imports will fall. If the demand for imports fall, the consumers will basically just stop buying imports. So less imports will enter the economy. Thus, the supply curve will shift to the left because less imports. Though imports are still present in the supply, there will be less imports. So you know what? This makes sense. So this is our option, this is our answer, and that is correct. Last one. What is not a likely cause of a deficit in the current account of the balance of payments? Again, what is the current account of the balance of payments? It is the record of a nation's transactions with the rest of the world over a defined period, and it includes goods, trade in goods and services, primary income, so sorry, secondary income, right? So goods, trade in goods and services includes exports and imports of goods and services. Exports being what goes out of the country, imports being what comes into the country. Primary income being income or payments coming in from abroad, such as wages from a worker working abroad, or dividends or foreign investments. Secondary income referring to transfer payments, which basically means that you get the money for free without needing to give anything in return. For example, foreign aid. Now the question asks, what is not a likely cause for a deficit on the current account? Now a deficit means that everything, all of these components, if you add them up, it should have a minus value. It should be less than 0. When it says what is not a likely cause, it means that we are looking for a reason that will not cause a deficit, so maybe it will cause a surplus or a balanced budget instead. So let's look at the options. The first one says because consumer spending is low. Now, if consumer spending is low, that means that consumers are buying less stuff. They are spending less. So if they spend less, since imports are what come into the country because consumers buy them from abroad, less imports will come into the country because, well, consumers are spending less on imports. So less imports. And because in the current account balance, we calculate the net exports, which is exports minus imports. If the value of imports fall, the net exports rises. That means trade in goods and services will rise. So this as a whole will increase, causing a surplus. So this is a reason of why the current account balance will be in a surplus. And that is not a reason why it will be in a deficit. So this is a possible answer. Keep that in mind. The second one says that primary incomes in the form of investment income are low. That primary income has decreased. If primary income decreases, then this as a whole will decrease, causing a deficit. So that is a reason for a deficit in the current account balance. This is a reason for a cause of a deficit. So this can't be it because we're looking for a reason that is not a cause of a deficit. Now the third one says the rate of exchange is high. What is the rate of exchange? Well, this might be referring to the exchange rate, and if the exchange rate, the value of the exchange rate is high, that means that it has appreciated, the currency has increased in value. And if a currency appreciates, we know that the price of exports will become more expensive, and the price of imports will become cheaper. So, of course, we will always demand increase in demand for the thing that becomes cheaper, so imports will increase. If imports increase, then net exports will decrease, so the trade in goods and services will decrease, decreasing the current account balance as a whole, causing a deficit. And that is a reason for a cause of a deficit, not It's like not a reason, so this is not our option. Cross that off. Last one says the wage cost of production is high. The wage cost of production is high. So this means that wages have increased, making the cost of production higher. This means that it will be more expensive to increase the supply of the good. So the supply of the good is likely to fall because on a demand-supply diagram, right, downwards D, upwards S, price and quantity demanded. If the cost of production is high, the supply curve will shift to the left, which will increase the price and also decrease the quantity supplied. So the price of exports is likely to increase and the quantity supplied is likely to decrease because whatever we are producing here is being exported, right? So if the price of exports increases, they become less internationally competitive. Since it's not cheap, we will not demand it, so the amount of exports bought will fall, so net exports will fall, then the trade in goods and services will fall. This as a whole falls, increases deficit, not a reason for a cause of a deficit, so nope. So the correct answer is A. And that is the last question, and I hope this video was helpful to helping you understand this paper. And good luck. I'll see you again next time.